to show you how to integrate checkout.com into your website for collecting payments. Today specifically I wanted to talk about the Flow integration. Flow is a pre-built customizable payment user interface that can be directly embedded into your website. Flow basically handles the entire payment process. It shows the available payment methods, tokenizes sensitive payment details, handles a 3DS redirection. So the payment, so as a merchant, you don't have to worry about the PCI DSS compliance because the card details inputted are on the payment form rendered by the checkout.com servers. So you as a merchant don't have to worry about the PCI DSS compliance over here. So I wanted to show you a demo before we get into the integration workflow. So this is my checkout page where I would like to finally do a payment. So when I click on proceed to pay, you can see this is the payment interface rendered by checkout.com. I have a test card over here. I put an expiry in the future and I continue to payment. It redirects me to the 3DS authentication flow. So this is a simulation page because this is my test environment. In production it will be your actual issuing bank's 3DS page. So let me go ahead with this. And as you can see, the payment is successful. You can see this is the payment reference, amount, status is captured, and this is the reference I provided while creating the payment. So let's break this down. So this is the workflow for the Flow integration. The whole thing starts with the customer landing on your e-commerce checkout page. You're basically sending all the customer and order information to your server, and which internally calls the checkout.com payment session API. You get a response. That response is then propagated to your client, and using this payment session data, you're basically initializing and mounting the flow, which renders the payment interface which I just showed you. And this is where the customer inputs his card details, and once the customer clicks on pay, it basically goes to the checkout.com servers, does the payment request, and if there are any redirects, for example 3DS authentication, it handles that and then finally presents the payment outcome. So one thing after this we have to do is we have to verify the payment. So there are two ways we can do this. Once it gets redirected to your website, either you call the get payment details API with the payment ID to check if the status is captured. So you basically call your server, which internally calls the checkout.com get payment details API to check the status is captured. Or you can use checkout.com's webhooks, where once the payment is captured, they will push the webhook into your system. So basically from your client, you can keep polling your backend until you receive this webhook, and you can show the success or failure UI based on that. So basically first thing you have to do is you have to create a public key and a secret key in your dashboard. This is public key is used for the client side authentication, secret key is used for your server side authentication. So the first thing is basically creating a new payment session. So this is the API which I was talking to you about, where you have to first create a payment session. This is a sample request using which you create a payment session, and this is the response. So let me open the API reference over here. So this is the API reference for creating a payment session. So as you can see that there are some required fields for this. So first thing is the amount. The amount has to be passed in minor units. This is the currency, which is the 3-letter ISO currency code. The billing details. This is the success URL or failure URL. This is the URL to which you would like the redirection to happen. If it's a successful payment, it will redirect to the successful URL, success URL. If it's a failed payment, it will redirect to the failure_URL. And if you want, you can give a reference from your side. This is the processing channel ID. So this is basically this you will get when you create a key. So as I told you, you have to create a public key and a secret key. So if you go inside your secret key, you will see this processing channel ID over here. And I would like the payment to be a 3DS implementation, so I will pass 3DS node and enable true over here. So as you can see in this curl, you can see that in the payment session API we have to pass This token is the secret key which you have to create from your dashboard. So, so this is the secret key, which obviously you will not get the value because it's a one time. You'll only get the value when you initially create it. So you have to save it securely in your server. And using this secret key, you will basically call the payment session API. So as you can see, this is a sample request of the payment session API. It has the amount, currency, reference, the billing address details, customer details, success and failure URL, and this is the sample response. So what we do with this is what we are propagating to the front end, and using which we are mounting the flow interface. Let me show you this in the demo itself. So let me open my network tab, and so the whole thing starts with me creating a payment session. So this is where I'm creating the payment session. Let me just So as you can see, the moment I click on checkout, it internally calls my checkout/session API. This is my internal API, which internally calls the checkout.com's payment session API, and it gets the response, and you can see the response over here. It has the links node, it has the payment session secret and payment session token. This is what is used to initialize and mount the flow interface. So let me just show you the API in detail. So this is the internal API which is being called when you click on the checkout button. So you can see the amount, currency and reference is coming from the front end. Actually ideally you should not be passing the amount from the front end. The amount you should ideally be passing a cart ID from the front end, and in your server you should be retrieving the amount using this cart ID. And here I'm creating a payment session. You can see here, this is where I'm building the request for the payment session. So you can see amount, currency, the reference for this is the merchant display name, this is the processing channel ID which I had explained to you, this is the billing address details, this is the customer details, and this is enabling 3DS, and this is the success and failure URLs to which payment to redirect to based on success and failure scenarios. So once you build this request object, I'm basically calling the checkout.com API over here. So you can see over here REST template.exchange. This is where I'm making a network call to checkout.com/payment session, and I get the response over here, and I'm propagating this response to my front end, which is what you see over here. So this is the first part of the integration, where I call the payment session API, and this is then used to mount the flow interface. So let's get into that. So for mounting the flow interface, either you can use the npm package which checkout.com gives, or you can load the package directly via script. It's up to you. But the whole workflow is basically you have to use the public key which you had created, and then you get the payment session from your backend, and you pass the environment you're on. Is it sandbox or live? See that the whole thing starts with me calling handle proceed to payment. So this is what happens when you click on proceed to payment. Now this internally calls my internal API checkout/session, which is calling the checkout.com payment session API. Once I get the response, I'm basically saving it in my store. So you can see over here, I'm saving it in my store. And once I get this value, then I'm basically initializing the checkout in my front end. So this is where I'm mounting and initializing the flow interface. So you can see that I'm using the npm package which checkout.com has given me, and I'm passing the checkout session details which I got from the backend into this. You can see it's checkout session.id, the checkout session.payment session secret, the session token. So you can see these values. To load the flow, I'm using the public key which I generated from the portal, the environment, and I'm using these handlers also. So here is where I'm creating the flow component. So checkout.create flow, this creates the flow component, and here is where I'm mounting it. So I have my container which is called the flow container, and I'm mounting it over here. So that's how you see this page which you're seeing currently over here. So this is the workflow which shows this entire page. Now, now the next part is the actually entering the card details and going ahead with the 3ds payment. So let's do that. So let me get the test card details. So once I go ahead with proceed with this payment, it redirects me to the 3ds page. So just wanted to just talk about the 3ds flow over here. So in 3ds is determined by the issuing bank. So there are two basic flows in 3ds, which is the frictionless flow and the challenge flow. So in the challenge flow is this is the challenge flow. In the challenge flow, the issuing bank gives you a challenge for you to proceed with the payment, and in the frictionless flow, it authenticates the payment directly. And now it redirects me back to my redirect URL. So this is the redirect URL which I had given while creating the payment session, and as you can see over here, we have, let me just, so you can see it has a payment session ID, the session ID, and as well as a payment reference ID. So what I do, there are a couple of things happening over here actually. Once it gets redirected to my success URL, I am taking the payment ID and I'm calling my internal get payment API, which is calling the checkout.com get payment details API to verify if the payment has happened successfully. So as you can see, as soon as it gets redirected, I am taking the payment API, I'm taking the payment ID, and I am passing it to my internal API, which internally calls the checkout.kp, and I'm getting this response from checkout.com. So you can see over here the status is captured as well as approved is true. So this is what confirms the payment has been captured successfully. So let me just show you that in code also. So let me go to my result page, and here if you see, once the redirection happens, once the 3ds authentication is done and the redirection happens to my success URL, I basically fetch the payment ID, and I am basically calling my internal API over here with this payment ID, and I'm waiting for the response. And once I get this response, I basically this is that node. I basically check if the approved is true and the status is captured, and based on which I'm showing the success UI over here. So this is one implementation. Another implementation would be to use webhooks, where once the 3ds authentication is done and the payment is captured, checkout.com will push a webhook into your server, and you from the client will keep polling your server to get this webhook details. So once the webhook is pushed to your server, you like in the meanwhile you'll be polling your backend to get to check if this response has arrived. Once this response has arrived, and you check the status over there, and you basically do the redirection to show the success UI or the failure UI. So this is the end-to-end flow of how it works. One specific thing I wanted to just this is the API reference for the get payment details. So as you can see over here, again you have to pass the secret key. This is the payment ID which you need to pass, and you can see the response over here. So you get if the status is captured, and you get approved, whether the payment is successful, approved, true. So let me show you that in my code also. So this is that internal API which is called once it gets redirected to the success URL with the payment ID from the client, and I'm in this API I'm basically calling the checkout.com payment details API using the payment ID. I basically do REST template.exchange, and this is where I'm getting the payment details, and then I'm passing it to my front end. So yeah, this is the end-to-end flow. So the test cards, you can use different the test cards are obviously available over here. One specific thing I wanted to talk about was the 3D secure authentication. So it is done basically as an additional step while you're doing online payments. The idea is to help reduce fraud and meet regulatory requirements. So there are main two flows in the 3ds flow which I was talking about, which is the frictionless flow as or the challenge flow. So the frictionless flow is where the issuing bank decides based on all the transaction data available that it can authenticate the cardholder immediately. The challenge flow is basically the issuing bank wants more information before authenticating the payment. So, and then another thing I want to talk about is liability shift. So once the 3ds authentication is successful, then the liability basically shifts to the issuing bank. So there are some ECI values which determine this. So for MasterCard 02 or non-Master 05 basically means that the liability shift happens with the issuer. So in the future if there's a chargeback raised, the liability is on the issuer. 00 and 07 basically means that the liability shift lies with the merchant. So it's up to like the merchant to decide whether to authorize the transaction or not. But if a chargeback is raised in the future, the liability remains with the merchant. Yeah, that's the end-to-end flow. Thank you guys.